So what I'll be offering you all tonight is something of a mashup of 3 essays that are in the book of essays, Someone Shot My Book. I've worked to try to make this disparate utterance cohere, but there will be fissures and gaps, and I hope you'll forgive them or fill them with your own imagination. Some portions of this talk, the first sort of few sections, are similar or identical to a talk I gave at Naropa Summer Writing Program a couple summers ago. Maybe a few of you were there. There are a lot of quotes, and so that's why there will be this PowerPoint to help you follow along. So we made some copies of the talk that you can read if the light is good enough, or if you need to, you can use your phone. And that's really just for accessibility's sake. So if you're a person who finds it difficult to follow for any reason at all, that's for you. So you can go grab one of those if you don't have one. There's also some in large print. Though I would ask that you not take them home, because this is not a finished product. I don't really want it circulating necessarily, except for in your mind. Okay, yeah. So I'll just say that the first half of this talk is going to be largely theoretical. The second half will turn to a specific, which is the dance by Ralph Lemon, or a little portion of the dance by Ralph Lemon called Come Home Charlie Patton, and a poem by Fred Moten, who wrote about Lemon. And Moten's thinking will appear throughout this talk, along with some others, especially Julia Kristeva. And my hope is that for those of you who were here for Fred's visit in February, that this will be a good sense of continuity. Okay, if the theoretical language gets overwhelming, you can look forward to the video. Just coming. There are 9 sections. Let's see if this, no? Click, click, click. To this? No? To this? No? Maybe a battery problem. I can't start without the PowerPoint, so. Okay. Section 1 is called Alive. Revolutionary poetry may exceptionally have nothing at all to say about any fact that will be identified as political. Its grammar may be thoroughly opaque, and its sentences almost totally free of direct social reference. But imperatively, it must do this one thing. It must hurt and thrill a reader with an irresistible premonition of the feeling of being more fully alive and really alive than ever before. The feeling that is the true, unmistakable, and inalienable basis of revolutionary subjective universality. Keston Sutherland. Oh, there we go. Now, back. I want to start here in this statement about liveliness, poetry, and revolution, because I want to believe in the possibility of insurgent energy, of revolutionary momentum, and in poetry's relation to that. I want to believe that poems play a crucial role in the eternal resistance to the racist, patriarchal, capitalist state. I want to believe in that language-based art that is itself so alive that it offers its liveliness up, generating and spreading that feeling of being more fully alive than ever before, that surge of energy that is our desire and our love, our elsewhere and our otherwise. A live language, like a body, is restless. It shifts, it fidgets, it adjusts itself to its speaker and its listener and to its surround. Like a body, such language is both common and strange. It holds force not because it knows what it wants and says it, but because it does not know and says that. We move as we write, not to make a demand, but to discover desire and desire's partners, grief, anger, pleasure, and states we can't yet name. Desire is the offering, says Cecilia Vicuña. Poetic language lives not as a representation of us, but as the voice of something we don't yet recognize as us. Again, Vicuña, my work dwells in the not yet. But many have said in various ways that awakening this feeling of being more alive than ever before is exactly what writing can never do, that writing is instead a form of estrangement, that in attempting to represent experience, writing kills experience, even when turning away from mere representation or mimesis, even when poems try to be experiences rather than simply describing prior ones. Some will point out that the poem and all writing always falls short. Whatever the experience one might have in having a poem, some say, it's always at a remove from the real, which would then have to be understood as pre-linguistic or surlinguistic, as bodily and immediate. And yet, it's precisely in the failure, in the gap between language and experience, that the poem does its work. A poem can draw us nearer to our intensities, not because it describes our feelings with accuracy, but because it does not. Which is why the single most resonant sentence about grief that I know is from Emerson, writing on the death of his son, "I cannot get it nearer me." One could say that the root of social pain is this failure to make language arrive with precision, but then so are the roots of social presence. To write is to approach. Again, Vicuña, desire is the offering. The failure to arrive at truth, at representation, at pure intimacy moves us. Effort and failure move us, drawing us closer to or more aware of our longings, which is to say, our life. For the very reason that poetry fails to bring us our experiences of loss, desire, vulnerability, it is loss, desire, and vulnerability. A 14-line poem on not giving up. 1, a freckle between her shoulder blades. 2, I keep trying to zip it. 3, have never. 4, this system of marks, scrapes, and wounds. 5, made palatable. 6, on stage or screen or page. 7, no, no. 8, but I wanted to be some kind of healer or farmer. 9, to be the one, the wounded one. 10, to make my mother cry. 11, desire achieves its lastingness. 12, pity, narrative. 13, pity, the body. These 14, astringent, bright blooms. Only sheer violence is mute, said Hannah Arendt, who also wrote that great speech and great action are coeval and coequal, belonging together in the realm of the political. But if reasoned speech stands opposed to mute violence, poetic writing stands instead against it, leaning on it the way we might lean against a wall. This is because, unlike speech, the language of the polis, of the poles, and the politicians, poetic language reaches toward the silence of grief, the muteness of violence. Poetic language lives in that reach, never arriving. As poet Andrew Joran puts it, where language fails, poetry begins. The poetic cry, he says, is a triumph in defeat. 2, scar. Poetry is a scar, writes Fred Moten on a number of occasions, pointing to the ways that poems tend to mark wounds, revealing the places we, as an individual or social body, are broken or cut. Poetry miscommunicates catastrophe in unseemly festivity, he says. In his critical study in The Break, Moten writes of the moment where shriek turns speech into song. He finds one articulation of this in Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life, where Douglass describes in close succession the shrieking of his Aunt Hester as she is being whipped, and the reverberation of the wild songs sung by enslaved people who, in Douglass's words, consult neither time nor tune. Douglass calls these songs rude and incoherent, noting that even though he could not make out their words, they filled him with sadness, moved him to tears. A disturbed and disturbing form of communication aims at that which is disturbed and disturbing in the world or in ourselves. Like a scar, the poem is a fissure and a place of new growth. The unseemly scar marks the seam where we have come apart in order to come together. A scar is a healing, but an imperfect one, and like the cut in a tree or the vaginal opening, it allows for new directions, new movement, new flesh. Mother. There's nothing like the objection of self to show that all objection is in fact recognition of the want on which any being, meaning, language, or desire is founded, wrote Julia Kristeva in 1980. In Revolution and Poetic Language, which is 1977, Kristeva describes this founding in want as a phase in human psychic development she names the Cora, during which the pre-linguistic person finds herself in a bodily, rhythmic, semiotic motility, those are her words, semiotic motility, regulated by and dependent upon the mother's body. The developmental version of the Cora precedes the so-called mirror stage, in which the child, having broken from the mother's body, begins to structure its identity through the symbolic order. But crucially, Kristeva emphasizes that the semiotic Cora is not a stage that is superseded or transcended. Rather, its status is continual in dialectic with the symbolic. And so when she uses, for those who aren't familiar, when she uses these terms semiotic and symbolic, what she means is the semiotic is a form of communication or language in the sense that is based in the body and is grounded in rhythm and sound, whereas the symbolic would be the rest of language, grammatically oriented language. As the symbolic's precondition, the semiotic is also its twin. While Lacanian theory posits in Kristeva's words that dependence on the mother is severed and transformed into a symbolic relation to another, Kristeva argues for the continued presence of the pre-symbolic semiotic motility, and therefore attachment to the mother, which finds its expression precisely in art, and especially in poetic language. It's in poetry that we can clearly see the disruption of the symbolic at play. A disturbed and disturbing form of communication aims at that which is disturbed or disturbing in the world or in ourselves. Breaks in normative grammar, the overt use of rhythm and sound, syntactical disturbances, and the refusal or delay of semantic meaning all constitute the semiotic in language. And these are the literary devices that poets always call upon in defining their art. But what's most distinct and to me lasting about Kristeva's take is that her semiotic is first and foremost a language of the body and of its drives that are regulated through their dependence on another. Their presence in the poem, then, is the mark of abjection or dependency, which Judith Butler and others posit as a foundation for justice. I, you. Unlike a poem whose object might be absence, the missed, or the missing, violence directs itself toward a presence, a scene, or in the case of precision-guided ammunition, mapped object. And though it probably goes without saying that the perpetrator of violence is in some way confused about his or her desires, in the moment of enacting violence, the positioning of subject and object, the grammar, could not be more clear. I hurt you, subject, action verb, object. The thetic break is Kristeva's term for the linguistic structure of this relation. Any statement that insists on the position of the subject as subject is, in her terms, thetic. The thetic, so thetic like thesis. The thetic phase of language acquisition establishes the speaker as a subject in relation to whom all other things and beings are objects. There can be no language without a thetic phase, admits Kristeva. And yet, in describing ritualized sacrifice as an extreme manifestation of the thetic, she acknowledges the violent potential lurking in all structural relations, linguistic or otherwise, where a subject acts upon an object. The sacred sacrifice, which is found in every society, is then a theologization of the thetic, she writes in a chapter of Revolution in Poetic Language titled Poetry That Is Not a Form of Murder. And yet, as the title of that chapter indicates, Kristeva argues that not all language is in this way violent. Poetry answers to the violent face of the thetic by offering the ontological dislocation that opposes the thetic break. This is a little bit dense. Poetic mimesis, she calls it, which is just another a way to talk about the particular and peculiar ways that poems describe the world. Poetic mimesis is led to dissolve not only the denotative function, but also the specifically thetic function of positing the subject. So poetic mimesis manages the dissolve of the thetic precisely because poems can work to dismantle the clear separation of subject and object. This blurring of boundaries between I and you, experienced not only in poems, but also, and crucially, in the earliest relationship between mother and infant, is what Kristeva refers to with the term jouissance. So this is our last little dive into Kristeva, and then we'll move on. In cracking the socio-symbolic order, splitting it open, changing vocabulary, syntax, the word itself, and releasing from within them the drives born by vocalic or kinetic difference, jouissance works its way into the social and symbolic. In contrast to sacrifice, poetry shows us that language lends itself to the penetration of the socio-symbolic by jouissance. Not just an idea about language, Kristeva's semiotic symbolic oscillation allows for an identity similarly oscillating between dependence and independence, between self-presence and abjection, between law and movement, and because of such uncertain founding, an identity in relationship not, or not always, girded by violence. Kristeva goes farther to suggest the revolutionary political potential of this recognition or rapture, writing that only when the semiotic is present to disrupt symbolic signification and the division between subject and object that the symbolic expresses and enforces is blurred, only then does the signification process join social revolution. Body. There's no such thing as the human, writes Athena Athanasiou. Instead, there is only the dizzying multiplicity of the cut human, the human body as interminably cut, fractured. In the clefts of history and at the limits of representation, the cut body of humanity tells the story of the indeterminability that haunts the dreams and nightmares of the fully there. Every time I read that phrase of the fully there, I think of Trump. I return to this moment in Athanasiou's The Technology of Humanness because of how it summons us to the cut and the scar, not only as a mark of specific wounding or trauma, but also as a fundamental ontology. Many of you will remember Fred Moten on this stage last month. Can I just get a sense who was here for that talk? Yeah, that's what I thought. Good. So many of you will remember Fred calling for a poetics of flesh rather than body. What's at stake is the necessity of a more emphatic inhabitation of flesh as something other than withdrawn or withheld or reduced body, as that which is therefore opposed to body, for a poetics of flesh, for a poetics of selflessness. For reasons grounded in the history of slavery and in the present time realities of anti-Black violence, Fred, following Hortense Spillers, ties flesh to Blackness and body to what could be called the first principle of whiteness, which is property. A poetics of flesh, then, would refuse the ownership, the authority, or what Athanasiou calls the sovereignty of the body. But the problem for the poet, a problem shared by anyone who seeks to create such a poetics of selflessness in any field, rather than a reinforcement or a shoring up of self, is how to balance this desire for radical openness with the experience of living in a society stratified and marked by group conflict. In a society where class, racial, and gendered conflict mark our bodies with such differing levels of vulnerability, suffering, or ease, where the most vulnerable people, those who are quite literally attacked, and today I'm thinking of trans women, of Black males, of the poor, and of the child. Though in Trump's America, or in America in general, there are many targets. The call for a poetics of flesh as opposed to body, for a poetics of selflessness as opposed to self, could seem almost perverse. This is how Athanasiou poses the problem. The problem then remains how to think representation, cultural, political, textual, without the ontological presuppositions of authoritarian self-presence. How to think the body beyond the ontic, how to think the political beyond sovereignty, and finally, how to think the language of the political beyond denomination. Poetic language, when most activated, when most alive, which means when most in motion, thinks through these questions by way of threading shriek into word, cry into articulation. The refusal of the sovereignty of self and body must continuously meet the acknowledgement of suffering and pain that bodies, and some more than others, are subject to. But this meeting is not a closure, but an opening, not a pronouncement, but a question, not a statement, but a sounding, and not a position, but a dance. And so, body. With this disavowal, or at least complication, of the very idea of the body as an object that we own, what might remain useful in the concept of embodied poetics? Perhaps we can begin to answer this question by considering that the body is not only a weight that we carry around or are forced to obey or seek to control or protect, and not only an identity that we can claim or know. It's also inchoate, obscured, even indecipherable. For the body in motion, as all living bodies always are, is not only a thing, it is an action. As Brian Masumi has written in Parables of the Virtual, the charge of indeterminacy carried by a body is inseparable from it. Far from regaining a concreteness, to think the body in movement means accepting the paradox that there is an incorporeal dimension of the body. In a brief essay titled Utopian Body from 1966, Foucault remarks on how utopian fantasies tend to feature an erased body, or a body freed of its mortal flaws, of its limits and its borders. The great myth of the soul, he writes, is the most obstinate, the most powerful of utopias, with which we erase the sad topology of the body. And yet, Foucault goes on, but the body is not so easily reduced to this topology. It too has its invisibility, its mysteries, its phantasmagoric qualities. It is transparent. It is imponderable. Nothing is less thing than my body. It runs, it acts, it lives, it desires, it lets itself be traversed with no resistance by all my intentions. Really, there is no need for magic, for enchantment. There's no need for a soul. For me to be both transparent and opaque, visible and invisible, life and thing, for me to be a utopia, it is enough that I be a body. The body. The thing we might at times want to escape is also the elsewhere we want to escape to. Not because it houses delight, though it can, and not because it demands to be seen, though it does, but because it is so finely unknowable. My body, as Butler puts it, Judith Butler, is and is not mine. Both because in some very real and even legal ways it belongs not to its wearer but to the social or political world it inhabits, but also because paradoxically when we feel most in our bodies we also confront the very mysteries of the body which came from our mother and belongs to the earth, and at the same time lives in and through the bodies of our children, beloveds, and our enemies. The body, site of our strangeness to ourselves, the site of our radical belonging to that which is other. And yet, again, there is no body. There are only specific bodies. The public phenomenon of the body that Butler points to, or of a body in particular, is always felt more sharply by those marked by difference of race and gender and ability, most acutely by those whose difference is always in some sense on display. To write the experience of a body is always, therefore, to write from the idiosyncrasies of a particular life. So it's precisely in this tension, then, between the real life of the solid and socialized body, which none of us can get outside of, and the fact that our bodies are never really still, never really knowable, belonging not to ourselves alone, but also to the others that surround us, name us, love us, or hate us, that poetry can so deeply explore. If poetry is going to have goals beyond repetition of the status quo, in other words, if it's going to in some way imagine a world in which things would be different, if it's going to draw us toward our insurgent dreams of otherwise and elsewhere, then the poem must include the body itself, a site not only of failure and suffering, disgust and death, but also of pleasure, of birth, of play, intimacy, ambition, and finally, mystery. The body is a marker of difference and the suffering that difference can produce. The body is a marker of presence and the pleasure and triumphs that pleasure make possible. And the body is also the site of our estrangement, our radical strangeness from and to even ourselves. So now we'll shift gears. Was that a sigh? I know. And so I'll turn now to two interrelated examples of writing that are, I believe, embodied, which is to say, alive, in motion, keeping in mind all the complexities and contradictions of the very terms of the body. These two moments could be read, and I'm going to read them, as a single interwoven line, an improvisatory line that is the meeting between Fred Moten and the dancer, choreographer, writer, and artist Ralph Lemon. I'll start with Ralph. Near the end of the proscenium portion of Lemon's multimedia work, Come Home, Charlie Patton, Lemon stands inside a wooden box, his profile to the audience, speaking into a mic. The story, poem he tells, a mashup of his own writing, that of Arna Bontemps, and historical documents, is of Elias, who, as a child, watches two people, one is his grandmother, ride a horse off a cliff. This calm and surreal suicide or escape, this moment of falling, which is also release, becomes part and parcel of Elias's trouble. Years later, Lemon narrates, Elias is arrested on his birthday, seized just at the date of his becoming, so that he becomes altered or enters an altered becoming. On his return home, says Lemon, he made this dance. So you'll hear the story I just gave you a preview of.
One was of all that water. It began the day that Ginny and Jeff got all dressed up, walked out of their house to the shed, and rode their scrawny little horse off a cliff together. They fell, holding on to one another tightly, showing no excitement, the water booming below. Elias was a young boy then, was there, watching from the top of the hill, thinking it was all his fault. It wasn't. The horse was the first to hit the water. Then Jeff, Ginny. Damn, they ain't even scared. Oh shit! They weren't scared at all. Elias got older. Was much older when he stood next to that yellow pole. He was arrested that summer in Duluth on his birthday. Spent a few days in the county jail. When he got home, he made this dance.
So what is that dance? The soft shoe or shuffle is, as Lemon has written, derived from the so-called buck dance, forcibly performed by male slaves, head down, a body a little curved inward. The story of Elias takes place in 1920, for Elias is, in part, Elias Clayton, one of the 3 men lynched in Duluth, Minnesota by a white mob, a famous lynching in that it took place in a northern state. And so in this story and in this dance, we have the meeting of 3 historical epochs, that of slavery, Jim Crow, and now. It goes on. So when the hose arrives, we're also in Birmingham, 1963. And so in the body of the dancers, these times converge. Eventually, the dancers dance so hard they hit the floor. And then the sirens come and the lights too, the hard headlights of the law, bringing us back to the present time. The body carries historical trauma, but it's not only that. Because something else happens when Charlie Patton, who's been singing through the speakers, turns punk. The dancers do more than dance the trauma of history and its eternal return as law. They don't just dance their belonging to and under law, they dance their freedom from it, their extra-legal surreality, as we'll see. For Moten has written of Lemon in a poem he calls Hard Enough to Enjoy. And because it's Moten, it's going to get dense again, so stay with me just a little longer. Charged with the blackness of physics, its extra-legal social surrealities, in search of conceptual thaw, having survived the river's violent flows and squalls, its seizing distancing, but drawn to the river of rivers, Lemon began a long series of residencies in itinerants. Itinerants, or what Moten calls elsewhere and often fugitivity, is the extra-legal social surreality of blackness. Extra-legal because, as Moten talks about in his essays Knowledge and Freedom, Blackness and Governance, and elsewhere, blackness neither precedes nor follows the law and is within and outside of it at once. The river of rivers that Moten says Lemon is drawn to, if it is of reference to Wallace Stevens' poem, The River of Rivers in Connecticut, wouldn't be the first time that Stevens makes a presence in Moten's writing. In Stephen's poem, the great river runs, a gaiety, reflecting steeple and town, headed nowhere like the sea, flowing from fact to myth or thing to no thing. The river is forceful, of vigor, but then turns conceptual and abstraction. Tied then to Stephen's other late poems about the mind, the poem troubles immanence, turning and turning away from the object it announces. But Moten messes with Stephen's ear for nothingness, for the river in Moten's poem is definitely not Stephen's unnamed, forceful, curricular, northern Connecticut, a trope for whiteness, if ever there was one. In Moten's River of Rivers, the third river acts like a double or triple negative, putting a spin on the mind and turning it around again to face the real. What is it that Moten says Lemon is drawn to now that he has survived violence? Is it a river for real or a river in the mind, or is it both? River of rivers. I feel like a child saying this, and that's right, because a babbling river or a babbling word gets closer to the nonsense that Fred names fugitive presence, the here and not here of the body that hovers between or undivides mind and matter, between the lawlessness of the imagination and the bound flesh of historical presence. It feels right to babble, too, because the dancer is like a child living always between real life and the whispered free space of the imagination. The dancer, put perhaps more directly, cannot escape the body, even if playing in the mind. The dancer cannot and does not want to escape what he knows of his relationship to history and law, within nation and family, under the lights, through the air, and in the water of real-time, present-day violence and real-time, present-day pleasures. Hard enough to enjoy. Rupture, rapture. So this is the last section, the second to last section, but the last section where I'll talk about Moten. In the essay, Knowledge and Freedom, Moten begins with a moment in Kant's third critique, in which Kant acknowledges the lawless freedom of the imagination as that which requires tempering or policing by the lawfulness of the understanding. Without understanding's laws, the imagination, says Kant, will produce only nonsense. Moten runs in right there, into that dynamic between law and imagination as a kind of rupture or rapture in the discipline. Runs into what he calls an irregular opening of the regulative. The understanding, he writes, is in its unexplained and unattainable completeness, having been invoked as that which polices the imagination in its lawlessness, is itself both constituted and restrained by imaginative excess. Moten reminds there is no law without lawlessness, no understanding without imagination's escape from it. To come back to our earlier terms, there is no symbolic order without the semiotic, and there is no body without flesh. Moten ties and finds Kant tying the lawless imagination, this freedom, to blackness, and even more to female blackness, which he turns to as a trope of resistance. But it would be too simple to find in the dance or in the poem only two opposing features: the hose as law, as whiteness, as governance, as restraint, and the dancer as imagination, as lawlessness, as blackness, femaleness, and freedom. It would be too simple to say also that the law speaks and lawlessness utters nonsense. For what keeps me on the brink with Moten and with Lemon is the slipping and the falling between such oppositions. The hose and the unspeakable violence it recalls does not produce the dance as an answer, because the dance, you'll remember, precedes the hose. As Moten puts it, what's important here is to recognize that the melodramatic imagination is indispensable to critical philosophy, is the dark, invaginative foundation and the secret anti-foundational rupture of its philosophy's systematicity. That's a tough one. Invagination, that term that evokes birth, also describes a falling or folding in that makes the opposition between outer and inner impossible. To say then that the dancer responds to the law with her lawlessness would be as wrong as to say that the law responds to her with its vigor, or as right. The improvisation, the contact improvisation between the forces of movement, of freedom, and of escape, and the forces of stillness, of seizure, and of control, is in the end what the dance is, what it speaks. Invagination, the irregular opening. Only sheer violence is mute. But it's when things get unspeakable that the poem is, as such, is most called for, answering that call not with speech per se, but with speech's break, its broken cry. Recognizing that the very structure that we resist are also those that define us, just as the body as form cannot and still does contain us. Poetic language perverts and exploits the fissure in that confrontation, that irregular opening between the sound dance of reckless music and the language of and as the law. Perversion in a poetic landscape might look or sound like nonsense. To recall Sutherland from the beginning, its grammar may be thoroughly opaque and its sentences almost totally free of direct social reference. In a dance, it might look like falling, like hitting the floor. In the real world of the law that kills yet faces no law, the real world that precedes and follows Come Home, Charlie Patton, in which the white crowd gathers to cheer the lynching or floods the floor at the convention of its supremacy. Imagination's perversions might look like criminality. Its language might sound like a scream. Thank you.